right, welcome back to the Age of Meaning. Thank you for joining us today. We have a very exciting episode today. We're going to be talking about a lot of big, very significant things that'll be life-changing information if you haven't heard it before. So everything you've ever been taught about reality is basically wrong. This is the big news that we need to reveal to the public today. And the thing about it is that really, like seriously, what you've been taught in school about the meaning of life, about what reality is made of, about who you are as a person, is fundamentally flawed. It's completely missing the mark. And what we're finding now in science with quantum physics and philosophy of mind and academia is that the materialist physicalist paradigm, the secular kind of rational paradigm that we live in, is really, really missing a huge amount of information about reality. And it's completely wrong. It's deluding us and it's causing us to be depressed and meaningless. And it's really unacceptable. It's really a crime what they're doing. So we are going to correct that information. And we're going to do that by referring to the ancient wisdom. So we're finding now in quantum physics, first of all, that quantum physics is really questioning our normal assumptions about reality. And these assumptions have only been there for about 200 years. So let's say for the last 200 years, mankind has believed in this secular, material, physicalist worldview. One where we're atheists, we don't believe in God anymore. We threw out the old religions, the old fairy tales, the old superstitions. But now we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and we're living in this world devoid of meaning, where we reduce love and beauty and truth and consciousness to all these physical processes. We reduce all the things that make us human, all the things that give us a soul and define our humanity. We've reduced that to physical processes, and to basically survival and biological concerns. And, it sounds like it's quite a... Yeah.
Well, the thing is that we basically thought that we'd figured it all out, like ever since the scientific revolution came along, the rationalistic enlightenment, we thought that now we've got it. This is the way to understand reality. Then our technologies and our tools just got more and more sophisticated. So our picture of reality got more and more resolution to it. And we thought all of that religion and mythology and stuff, we don't need that anymore because now we figured it out. This is the way to understand reality. And then with that, a whole new worldview emerges, which is basically a materialistic worldview where we paint a picture of the world as somehow separate from us, some place that we inhabit, which is fundamentally made of matter. And we are just, bound to our bodies and sort of our body mind is what defines us as a being. And then the universe is basically dead. It's basically dead inanimate matter. And so we have license to just exploit that for our own gain because we are animated beings. And somehow that's the picture of reality that we ended up with, right? And only now, 200 years later, basically, our scientists who are working on understanding reality, figuring out that actually the model that we have of reality is starting to break down. So the cutting edge physicists at the moment reject materialism. They no longer believe in materialism. Materialism is officially debunked in the academy. There's no serious scientists anymore who still subscribes to materialism. But culturally speaking, that's still the world we're living in. That's still the model of the world that we have. And there's all these problems associated with that, right? There's environmental problems because we're exploiting nature to the point of exhaustion, right? There's a lack of meaning, which creates all these existential problems. We have a mental health crisis. There's socioeconomic crises that have all come out of this, model we have of the world, this worldview, which is so deeply ingrained. It's so common sense that in our culture, generally speaking, we don't even question that. We think, no, this is just what's real, right? This is just the way reality works. It's no, it's false. It's a false image of reality that you've been fed. It's now shown to be actually ignorant, right? Or false or
Totally.
incomplete, right? And so this is what looks like bad news is actually good news, and you're going to tell us why, right?
Exactly. So this is the good news. This is the good news because you have to clear away the falsehood before you can get to the truth. You have to deconstruct the thing that's in the way, the obstacle to understanding reality. So once we deconstruct the materialist, physical, dualistic paradigm, we can then clear that away, that image in our mind, and then start to do a real analysis and a real investigation into human thought and to our own consciousness to discover who and what we are in reality. and not just take it on faith, because that's what we do, and that's what you do in the old school religious system as well. If you're raised Christian and you're a dogmatic Christian, you just take it on faith, what someone tells you to believe. But the same exact thing happens in schools, in science, when we're taught this physicalist, materialist universe. Even though there's more logical things going on, there's rationality in that and thinking for yourself. Essentially, the fundamentals of reality are just taken on faith because we just absorb it from a culture when we're young. Um, and so it's not right, because we're human beings and we have these incredible minds. We have this profound intelligence that is animating us, and we can engage with the universe, the greatest mystery, the greatest source of I don't know, content about life and ourselves, and we can come to understandings. And so what we're going to talk about in this episode is some alternatives to materialism. And so what are the new emerging trends in human thought that are emerging, that are alternatives to the dying paradigm? So these are being manufactured out of the bones of a dying paradigm. And this is basically, the main thing is Analytical Idealism by Bernardo Kastrup. That's what we're going to look at today. There's also a panpsychism and cosmopsychism, and this kind of Donald Hoffman ideas as well, which is, I think it's also panpsychism. Um, and so these are the trends. And you have Federico Fagin as well, this quantum physicist who's writing about consciousness. And so there's these general trends away from materialist thought. And this is the cutting edge of human thought at the moment. But like you were saying, the amazing thing about it, and this is what me and Florian have personal experience of through studying the history of religions, doing our master's degree at the University of Amsterdam in Western esotericism, and our broader study as well of Eastern and Western spirituality, philosophy, and mysticism, is that what you find is that the current cutting edge of human thought that's coming out of quantum physics and philosophy is actually reflected in the ancient religions of the past. This is like completely undeniable at this point, to Florian and I. And so, yeah, so it's incredible that in the East and the West, you find it. Most spiritual people don't know anything about Western philosophy, Western esotericism. And
Mm-hmm.
most Western esoteric people, they're into the occult and the magic side and all that stuff, and alchemy, but they don't go deep into the worldview and the epistemology. And very few people can see how they all reflect core similarities while also having differences. But there's a core worldview that you can find in the history of religions and philosophy of mankind, in the history of mankind's thought, which is what we're now rediscovering in the modern age. And so it's
So
very,
one
very
thing,
exciting.
absolutely. I think this convergence, right, of like cutting edge scientific insight and philosophical theories of our age, the convergence of that with like ancient spiritual traditions, ancient spiritual wisdom. I think that's a majorly significant point. You know, like it's really mind blowing. And I think one little distinction I would already flag here, which we're going to return to later, is like when it comes to religion, when it comes to spiritual or philosophical wisdom traditions where we see this convergence happening, it's not religion as most people understand it, right? It's not religion how most people know it. That's because there's this distinction between exoteric and esoteric. So what most people know about religion, about the world religions and the history of religion, is like institutional religions. For instance, it's religion for the general population. It's religion that involves, you know, external deities that you have a relationship to, that you pay reverence to, right? That you worship. Uh, that's the exoteric. So exoteric means like the outer teaching, the teaching for the public, the teaching that's external. So that's the exoteric. But there's this more, or less well-known part of religious history, which is what we have studied through our masters, so which we have more knowledge about, but which generally is actually not that well known, which is the esoteric. And the esoteric basically means the internal, the secret or the hidden. It's not so plain, it's not so obvious. It's because actually it can't just be written out and dispersed among the masses. No, it actually depends on, a direct, intimate, or transformational, experience of what's called the divine, and it's within the esoteric domain. It's within that sort of mystical domain of spirituality that, and the teachings that surround that you actually find an image of reality which we now see converging with the cutting edge of philosophical and scientific insight of our day. And that's actually mind-blowing, right?
Mind blowing. It's completely astonishing. It's almost like, it's almost unbelievable. It's like a divine irony type of thing. It's extremely incredible because the dialogue going on here is like across thousands of years, right? Thousands of years. And it's one thing that I was thinking the other day is it's such a shame, really. It's really a shame that most people today don't actually know like what we don't know the history and the thought of mankind. So if people knew what the esoteric teachings of the West were, it would change the situation. If people had an understanding of the Eastern spirituality and philosophies and how that converges with the West, it would change things. And so it's a shame. It's like there's this human thought which exists. There's this intellectual history. There's this spiritual history. There's our cultural heritage. And it's like, we're deaf to that basically as modernists. We're deaf to the thought and the communication and the ideas of mankind. We don't know what that is. And so an example of that is like Hermeticism, like we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is an incredibly rich and deep and profound philosophy from ancient Egypt. And most people have never heard of it. But it's been a massive thing and it's influenced society. It's been a big thing up until, in the Renaissance. Um, um, and so it's a huge thing, but as modernists today, we don't know about it. And that is partly because of the politics around a worldview and ideology, right? Because of materialism today. So people have already deemed that stuff not valuable. So because of political, social reasons, we don't know about our history.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
So let's get into it.
All right. Okay, so we're going to talk about the alternative ontologies to this situation. The first thing, okay, we're going to also talk about perennialism. So just to frame that a little bit. So we have this, like I said, this non-materialist ontologies, non-materialist worldviews emerging, which are really beautiful, and they give us a way of, especially with Bernardo Kastrup, they give us a way of understanding reality that kind of is a bridge between our rational secular world and our analytical thinking and stuff like that into this more, I don't know, mystical, spiritual. Um, it's not mystical or spiritual though. Those are just words you can put on it. It's basically just a description of reality, which is basically the opposite of materialism, and it's true essentially. And so these things are kind of like a bridge between our current way of thinking and this new set of ideas. And I think it's interesting because Bernardo Kastrup, for those of you listening that are familiar with Bernardo Kastrup's work, it's interesting that he never frames it as a kind of spiritual system, and he never talks about God, and he never talks about non-duality. Well, he does talk about non-duality, but he frames it in this way as like, what I'm doing is just analytical philosophy, and it's just clear, normal philosophy, and I'm just drawing on George Berkeley and stuff. It's just normal, ordinary philosophy. But the elephant in the room is that what he's describing basically describes the ancient perennial spiritual wisdom, and it describes God, essentially. It describes what God really means, the esoteric meaning of God, which is that God is consciousness. God is a universal field that's manifesting the universe. God is an infinite being, or something like that. And so I'll just describe consciousness a little. I mean, I'll describe idealism a little bit here. So Bernardo Kastrup's idea is that you have this idealism, okay? And so there's 2 points that are going to be emerging in this episode as articulating the alternative to materialism. Okay, so let me go with that as well for a bit. So the thing about materialism, the current paradigm, is that there's 2 key things about it. And the one is that the universe is physical matter. It's dead physical matter. The second thing is that it's dualistic. So there's a fundamental separation between self and other, separation between your mind and your body, separation between all things. There's always duality. Everything is relative to each other. So all concepts and thoughts and language are relative and defined in terms of each other. So there's a duality. There's a dualism between mind and body, dualism between world and self, and the universe is physical. Now, the interesting thing that we've discovered over our years of studying the ancient religions is that the funny thing is that the perennial truth and the kind of the core spiritual philosophy that exists as an alternative to materialism and that Bernardo Kastrup is articulating is almost exactly antithetical. It's almost the exact inverse of the materialist paradigm in that it's fundamentally a non-duality. It's a unity, oneness, non-dual. And instead of the universe being made of material or physical matter, it's made of consciousness or spirit or energy or vibration or being or something like that. But it's alive, it's conscious, it's intelligent. There's an awareness to it, and it's not just nothing, dead mechanistic matter. And so isn't that like, what do you think about that? It's fascinating how there's this it seems like there's this inverse to the spiritual reality where it's like it's non-dual and it's non-dual consciousness versus dualistic materialism.
It's an absolutely radical shift, right? If you think about the model we have, the common sense model we have of the world, is that the world is the primary thing. The world exists out there. It's like the material universe exists, and that's the primary objective reality. And it's within that objective reality, which doesn't have a life of its own, that life can emerge. That there are beings who evolve and emerge, and then there are minds who get to experience that world. But the world is primary, right? That's like the common sense model of reality. And it's almost so commonsensical to us that it's actually unbelievably radical to suggest that it's not true, right? It's actually
Right.
unbelievable. And
True.
that's the thing, that actually science is kind of forcing us to acknowledge that this model of reality is actually not convergent anymore with our understanding of the data, of the facts. Just if you want to be rational about it,
Mm.
it's like the rational approaches, like the data actually show us that this model of reality is inadequate. And then the question becomes, so like what alternative model, for heaven's sake, could there even be, even imaginably, like how could anything else, make sense to us? Well, the thing is, there are alternatives, right? There are
Yeah.
alternatives. And like one of these alternatives is idealism, which is actually saying that, like, well, that world that you suppose to be out there and have an independent existence, where does it exist? It exists in your mind. It exists in your awareness, in your consciousness. That's actually all you know. That's all you have direct evidence of, is that entire world
Well,
existing in your mind, in your consciousness,
yeah,
right?
but there's also a field. So the world out there is also a field of consciousness arranging it. So you're not just in your mind. That's true that you only experience from your consciousness, but the world out there is a conscious field as well, arranging
Mm-hmm.
itself in this way to us.
Well, it remains puzzling to wrap your head around it, and how to understand it properly. And I think, well, you can do a better job than me in laying out the technicalities. But the point is that, like, this is an alternative ontology, an alternative model of what the nature of reality really looks like. And so maybe you can give us a quick rundown. It's like, what is idealism? What does idealism argue? What is somebody like Bernardo Kastrup, who is gaining more and more traction nowadays in public discourse? What is he saying? Basically, in a nutshell, what reality is like. And then we can get into, well, how does that compare to what we know about, these perennial wisdom
Mm.
traditions?
Mhm. Okay, so first I'll lay out what Bernardo Kastrup is saying essentially, and I will also then frame what he's saying as in our own way, so we don't have to use the word idealism because I don't think that word is very clear. It's kind of a antiquated philosophical term. I think a better phrase to use is non-dual consciousness, a non-dual consciousness framework for this episode. But so Bernardo Kastrup's idealism is essentially to say that, like you were saying, so the way that it works, if I'll just take the listener along for the philosophical um, arguments that he makes. And so the first thing is that, like you were saying, the first thing is that you're a conscious being. So you know that you're conscious and you exist, which let's define the word consciousness here. It's a difficult word to define and think about. It can be, but I think the word, like some substitutes for the word consciousness, awareness, mind, mentalness, basically something that's not physical. So me talking right now, I'm using my intelligence, I'm using my mind, my thoughts to think, and my awareness, I'm alive. I'm a thinking conscious being. Whatever that is that makes us thinking, and our awareness of our thoughts that we can tap into when meditating, that awareness is something that we know that exists because we are that thing we're thinking, we're experiencing right now. And so the point then philosophically is to go from that and to say, well, we've only ever experienced our thoughts and our consciousness and our awareness, and you've never experienced anything else besides that. So all perception, everything you've ever experienced is perceived through consciousness. When you touch a table, when you look at a table, you're experiencing it through consciousness. The perception, the phenomena is arising within your consciousness, and you can never get out of your consciousness.
Yeah, so what would you say, like, if you meet somebody at a party and they've never heard of idealism before and they're just firmly
Right.
vested in their old materialistic paradigm, like, how do you explain to them, like,
Yeah, great question.
idealism, or like
Yeah,
what is Bernardo Kastrup arguing?
Yeah, you can't do it down the phenomenological lens. It's too deep. It's too strange. It's a good point. So I was going to get to that to be like, so basically, idealism in a nutshell is to say that reality is made of consciousness, a universal, generalized consciousness. So instead of physical matter and the brain producing consciousness, it's actually the case that the brain is like a receiver for consciousness, and that consciousness exists in a universal, generalized sense, some sort of pure awareness, pure being, pure mind, pure energy, pure spirit. Universal consciousness is the fundamental substance of reality, which is then organizing itself as physical matter. It's organizing itself as your physical body. And you, as an individual being, are an expression of the universal field of consciousness, and your consciousness is an aspect, a contracted or a fractal form of the universal consciousness. And so then physical matter is almost like, if you look at the quantum physics, what it's saying about reality is that there's no such thing as atoms and molecules in a strict sense. They're relative things that emerge. And what's really at the base of reality is a quantum field of energy, quantum field of excitations. And that quantum field is the process of consciousness, the universal mind, kind of this nothingness, basically this nothingness, no physical object, but conscious and intelligent, emerges and creates the physical matter. So there's a vibration, there's a density, and then there's a physical matter is basically the dense vibration of the universe. And so like the objects are vibrating in a certain way that they maintain a solidity. But what quantum physics is telling us, when you look into the physical matter, they're just a field of energy. So this is kind of the alternative view. And the other aspect of that is that it's fundamentally consciousness. And there's another key to that, which is that if everything is consciousness, then that means that everything is one. It's one mind, one infinite, universal, generalized consciousness. And it's also important to say that it's not like a human mind with thoughts, and it's not the same thing as like saying there's one giant being like God thinking, like a person with an ego. It's more the case that at the base level, we can say that reality fundamentally is this kind of substance, which is the same category of thing as your awareness and your consciousness. And that you, as a conscious, aware entity, are fundamentally in a unity of substance. You are the same ontological category as the entire universe. So we can also add then, in the spiritual traditions, unlike Bernardo Kastrup, there's a soteriological aim. There's a purpose to life in a spiritual sense, which is for your individual localized small consciousness to realize itself as an expression of the entire whole universal consciousness.
Yeah, I think this is a big thing, right? Because on the one hand, it's like you have
Massive.
the quantum fit. Yeah, it's insanely, yeah, it's mind boggling. It's like the way I see it is like we have the quantum physicists studying physical matter, or initially we had physicists, like classical physicists, studying matter and then coming up with this classical physics of like large objects and the laws of nature. But then as the physics gotten more and more sort of precise and could, zoom into more and more fundamental level, they discovered that that world that we thought we knew breaks down. And what they discover is at the very bottom is this field of infinite potential, basically, where every single point has the potential information of the entire manifest universe. And it's like it's like this holographic principle
Mm-hmm.
applies, which is insane. And it's like the quantum physicists are telling us that, but it's almost like we're standing at the sidelines and we just hear their reports and we're like, wow, that sounds confusing. It's like, I don't know what to make of that. But then I think the essential supplement here is actually the spiritual wisdom that we get from, all kinds of ancient spiritual wisdom traditions from the East, but also like the esoteric traditions from the West, or the mystical traditions from the West, that say like, well, actually that thing that they're discovering, that they're figuring out on a physics level, the fact that, everything, the whole is contained in the single point, and there's this field of infinite potential that, unifies everything. Actually, it's available to you to know what that's like
Mm,
experientially, to experience that,
mm,
and to transcend your limited condition into a state where you transcend your ordinary boundaries, and you transcend the boundaries of your mind to actually directly experience that. And that's the mind-boggling thing. It's like as if quantum physics wasn't mind-boggling enough. Here's another fact, which is that you can actually experience what that thing that they're discovering is like.
Right.
Because you are that. You just don't know it because you're stuck in this middle sort of, illusory reality. That's what the ancient mystery traditions and the ancient spiritual wisdom traditions, that's what they point towards, right? And only now are we putting these dots together, because only now are we discovering this on a physics level, right? So this is actually a huge moment in the history of mankind.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's so true, and it's so true when you see it like that in the quantum sense with the quantum field. Like the quantum field is an infinite field of vibrations. And this is what they teach at the Vipassana retreats. When I did the Vipassana, it's like you become so subtle in your body, so conscious, so subtle, that you will eventually experience like the raw material of your body, the raw material of your being, which is this infinite field of vibration, this infinite field of consciousness, energy. So it's just an incredible, and that's what the Buddha was teaching, even that in that explicit way with that field of vibrations. It's just extraordinary. So yeah, this is a huge moment for mankind. This is a huge moment for mankind. And it's going to happen. I genuinely think that in the next couple hundred years, it might not be that soon, or maybe there'll be radical changes, but in the next couple hundred years, everything we're talking about now will become common knowledge. Maybe not, but it should be because it's true. But anyways, in the meantime,
It will, dude. It will for sure. I have no doubt about it. I have no doubt about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, materially, you never know what might happen. I mean, the universe is mysterious and has its own plans. But yeah. So, anyways, let's continue with so we've discussed the idealism, we've discussed the current trend in philosophy, this move towards consciousness panpsychism, why materialism is breaking apart, the need for alternative ontologies. And now we're going to look at some ancient wisdom ontologies. But before we do that, we're also going to discuss the very idea of perennialism. And perennialism is a fascinating and beautiful idea that exists in human history. And we've also studied it on a literal academic level, deconstructing it, reconstructing it, all kinds of things. And this is basically the idea that there's a fundamental truth to all religions. And I'll also just say that a lot of spiritual people intuitively believe this, or just take it on faith, basically, that all religions are talking about the same thing. All spiritual traditions are talking about the same thing. So now, why don't you give us a proper definition of that?
Right. So perennial philosophy. This is, it's a huge concept. If you just think about the word, what does it mean? Like perennial means basically present throughout the ages, right? It means like timeless or eternal, perennial. It's like always present throughout the ages. A perennial philosophy. So it's a wisdom tradition, like a specific view of the world, and a certain pursuit of wisdom. This term has been around for hundreds of years. It came up in the 16th century by a guy named, pull up my notes, by a guy named Agostino Stoico. He coined the term initially in the Renaissance, where in the Renaissance you already had this big tradition of basically, thinking about like, where do we find the real truth, like the juiciest sort of, truth when it comes to spirituality and religion. And there were different ideas. Some people said like, well, the ancients used to have access to some kind of real direct truth, and like over time it sort of decayed. And other people would say like, no, actually we're being educated more and more as humanity, and we're gaining more and more insight into the truth, and like we're approaching more truth. And then there were people who said like, well, truth has been discovered actually time and again in different cultural contexts, in different traditions, and they've always arrived at the same points. And that idea is called, philosophia perennis, or perennial philosophy. So that's basically the technical definition. Then this term was popularized by the writer Aldous Huxley, who you probably know from Brave New World. It's like his most famous novel, or Our Island. And he also wrote The Doors of Perception, where he talked about his mescaline experience. But he also wrote this book called The Perennial Philosophy in 1944, where he basically represented this argument again. And like he made a case that this is actually true, that there are all these, spiritual, mystical traditions from different cultures and different time periods, which are all pointing towards the same fundamental truth. And so I'll just like read a little bit like how he summarizes it in the conclusion. Like he opens the book with this. Basically, he says like it's these three things. It's both the metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds. There's one metaphysic. Then there is the psychology that finds, in the soul something similar to or even identical with that divine reality. So there already is this non-dual connection. And then the third is the ethic that places man's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being. So that's like the soteriological aim, which soteriology is like the study of salvation, basically. So our salvation we will find in this final moment of the true and lasting insight. The knowledge, which is it's more than a knowledge. It's more also an experience or an embodied thing, right?
Also, salvation is that word. How do you say it?
Soteriology, yeah.
Soteriology. So that word also means like a purpose to your life, like because it's in the Buddhist, the Christian salvation is the word is used, but in the Buddhist sense, the aim of life ultimately is to transcend samsara and to attain nirvana, and in Hinduism,
Right.
it's to attain moksha, and so the soul's liberation, the journey of the soul back to the one. So that's an interesting spiritual thing, which you don't get in strict philosophy or strict science or strict, Bernardo Kastrup style. But that's also part of the perennial philosophy for sure, the perennial spiritual philosophy.
Yeah.
So.
Right. And then Aldous Huxley says that, it's basically from our normal condition. We can't directly or immediately apprehend this. We don't ordinarily know what this is about. So actually, to most people hearing this, it sounds like abstract philosophy, and it's like, well, yeah, maybe, I don't know. Doesn't really feel like that to me. Well, the thing is, you need to meet certain conditions to actually experience that. And it's not something that you're supposed to just accept on sort of face value or just take on faith or something like that. No, the idea is, and this is what these spiritual traditions aim towards or are training their followers towards, is actually the direct experience of what that means. And this is the idea of salvation or enlightenment, right? And then Aldous Huxley says what do you need basically for that? He says making yourselves loving, pure in heart, and poor in spirit. In other words, you need detachment, charity and humility, basically. Those are the prime virtues that get you there. It's no surprise that these are also,
love and detachment. I think that's a good combination of words.
Right. Which you find also in all these different religions, right? Sort of a moral code. It's maybe that moral code is also supposed to pave the way for this type of realization.
So, and maybe it's derivative of the metaphysic. The moral. That's the key. That's something that nobody understands. Is that morality at its truest essence, to be good and true and beautiful, like in Plato's sense, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Morality is derived from the fundamental ground of being, from the ultimate, from the non-dual consciousness, from oneness, unity. And love is derived from unity. Love is unity. Unity is a metaphysical thing what the universe is creating into the world. The universe is manifesting the world and creating this multiplicity of forms out of the one. And so there's a connection between all those forms, which is called love. You can call that love. And so things like morality and being kind and loving and truthful and beautiful, these things are derived from the absolute. And that's when they have a grounding to them. And that's where we find meaning, finally, at long last.
Yeah. But you need to be willing to, you need to be open to that, right? And you need to be willing to actually go there. And so this is another thing that Aldous Huxley argues. He says basically empirical scientists, they also don't just accept the conditions of their, their sense apparatus, as the limitation to their study. No, they use a telescope to look at the heavenly bodies, and they use a microscope to look at the tiniest objects, and et cetera, et cetera. And he says if we want to be empirical theologians, then we also need to amplify our condition in order to gain a greater insight into the nature of the divine, and then of course, the case is not everybody can do that, or not everybody wants to do that. And then he says, the best thing one can do in the field of metaphysics is then to study the works of those who were, capable of doing that, and who, because they had modified their merely human mode of being, were capable of more than merely human kind and amount of knowledge.
They were tapping into the quantum field.
Wow, that's another way of saying that. That's another way of saying that. And tapping into the quantum field actually means actually coming to the realization that you are the quantum field.
Yes.
That's
and
the
you
thing, right?
experience yourself as that, the pure air substance, the essence of what you are. Deep down,
Right.
you're made of the stars, like you're made of stardust, like that Carl
Exactly.
Sagan type of thing. You're made of cosmic consciousness,
Mhm,
cosmic
mhm.
energy.
Yeah, this is the thing, and then basically the rest of Aldous Huxley's book, are all these different passages and verses and accounts from different spiritual traditions, from Taoism to Buddhism to to Hinduism to Christian mysticism to Islamic Sufism, etc., etc. Basically, the list goes on and on. We're all converging on the same point, right? Like what Alan Watts called, Alan Watts, who is the great propagator of like Eastern spiritual traditions. He said, like, you are it. That is the major insight. Like, you are it. Or this great saying from the Upanishads, like, that thou art, right? Or sometimes translated as thou art that, indicating that it's like the individual self, which in the Hindu context is like the Atman, is actually one with the ultimate ground of reality, i.e., the Brahman. Like this, those two are actually one at a fundamental level, and that's the experience that you can have. So that's kind of like the core insight, which is more than an insight, but it's also like an experience.
Mm-hmm. But it can also
so
be
here
an
again,
insight.
I would, yeah. Right,
I would just
exactly,
flag that it's
yeah.
like, because we're talking about worldviews here, and it can also be an insight. It can also be an understanding, an intellectual understanding. And someone can deconstruct materialism and then, for example, read Bernardo Kastrup's philosophical analytical work and realize the truth of that with their intellect and replace their model of reality, just their model of reality. And so it's not that you need to have this profound experience, even though this is a core element of human thought and the history of mankind. But it can also just be like a shift in our understanding of reality and an opening and an expanding our understanding and to start thinking more non-dual in more holistic, unified ways, and bringing that element of consciousness to the fore. If you see what I mean, like,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And I think maybe now for the first time in history, we're going to be ready to actually accept that kind of understanding as our working theory, because now it's not only the reports of the mystics and the sages,
right,
and the prophets, but now it's also the reports of our very best, quantum physicists. They're actually converging on this model of reality, which is fundamentally non-dual. And so now maybe finally we're ready to kind of take that up into the mainstream, as our new common sense understanding, and that will be a huge, sort of, a huge leap, in terms of coming into alignment with something that's just more true. Which that's the value. That's the value that we're after here. It's like we want to be as true as we can be in our mode of alignment, in our understanding of reality, right? And so
yeah.
I think that's going to happen.
And it's incredible because we know that materialism, the simple materialism view, is debunked. This is no serious scientist or philosopher believes this anymore or will defend. They will, some will, but it's been debunked. And so now, if there's a situation where we're no longer living with a model of reality that's accurate, it's not aligned with reality anymore. It's not aligned with the truth, because there must be a way that reality is, right? If you just think about it, there's some way that reality is, and there's a way that it's not. Like, reality exists and it must be some way, and we are operating with a faulty understanding of reality. I mean, it's gargantuan, and it also wrongly defines ourselves to ourselves. So we have this
Right.
mistaken view and a mistaken understanding of who and what we are.
Exactly. Our culture is still running on Windows XP, like, or
Exactly.
Windows 98,
Exactly.
We sure desperately overdue for a software update.
Yeah. We're like, yeah, wow. We're trying to play, yeah, exactly, man. We're trying to play like the next Call of Duty Warzone on Windows XP. It's not going to work. No, we're way behind on a software update. It's incredible. And it's bizarre that the old religion, like the 4,000-year-old jungle sages of India, somehow were running like the futuristic software in some ways. It's bizarre.
Right.
Even though in other ways
Yeah.
we are more developed and more cognitively and technologically developed, the spiritual core and understanding has been there since the beginning of time in human history.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Well, I think that's the thing, that, there have been these individual awakenings throughout history, basically, and that they have become the sages and the prophets who have been revered. But I think what we haven't seen yet is a collective awakening. And I think
Mm,
that we're now on the cusp of a collective awakening. And now the conditions are finally starting to be right for that to actually happen.
mm,
Because, it's always happened in individuals, and that's always been possible. But it's never happened on a collective level, that this is ingrained as our understanding. And this happens when science and spirituality converge. And that's what we see happening today.
mm,
And that's what we're talking about, right?
mm, for sure.
Um,
And I
yeah,
think it's interesting because there's also the philosophical kind of and the academic or the humanities study of history and human thought, which is sort of the philosophy is sort of coming to a head where and the sort of the non-dual consciousness insights are kind of like emerging, like in this light being refracted, and it's almost like now at this point in the Western philosophical canon and this history of religious studies and this the general humanities after postmodernism and things like that, relativism, deconstructing, like now we're having this logical, coherent understanding of reality emerging. Like, so this non-dual consciousness is emerging on a thought level as well, which is interesting.
right.
So you have that
Absolutely.
and the quantum and the spiritual experience and the psychedelics as well, which are a new thing in history. Psychedelics only emerged in the 20th century. They re-emerged. Maybe they were there in the ancient days, but now they re-emerged, LSD, psilocybin. And that's also been a huge thing to give many people awakenings and opening. And so that's another historically timely thing that's happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is also for Aldous Huxley, it's like one of those technologies that can allow you to come to this kind of understanding in a more experiential way, right?
Mm, mm,
Which is not unique to our contemporary context, because there's like in ancient mystery traditions in antiquity, like there's direct evidence that they were using these technologies, like
mm,
mind altering substances to come to their spiritual revelations, basically.
mm,
One more thing I would like to add on the perennialism is that, it's often in a naive way, it's often portrayed as like, all religious traditions point towards the same truth, which then tends to overlook difference, right? And I think what is important here is this difference between the exoteric and the esoteric that I laid out before. So the exoteric, the external teaching for the public, the doctrine and the rituals, of course, there's a lot of diversity there,
mm, mm,
like doctrinal disagreements even within major religions, right? Let alone between religions, like major differences. But the fact is that on the esoteric side, on the side of the direct mystical revelation, you could say, the experiential, that's actually where you see all of these different traditions and their mystics, their mystic representatives. That's where you see them converging, right? So that's where you see like the Christian view of union with God, or the Sufis, talking about annihilation in the real, the annihilation of the self in the real. You have the Vedantic formula of the Atman, is the Brahman, like those two are one. And it's even the experience of the void in Buddhism that also actually converges with that. So there are still differences, right, in the way that there are that these experiences are spoken about in the discourse around it. But actually, if you compare them and you know what they're talking about, you're open to that, then you see actually that they're pointing to not only a same metaphysic, but also like a same experience.
mm. Yeah, there might be differences in aspects. There might be different aspects of these profound states of consciousness. It might be that some people are experiencing the pure vibration of the quantum field. Maybe some people are writing about ego transcendence and a shift into, I don't know, pure consciousness, Brahma Loka or something. And maybe there's a whole field, there's a whole range of these kinds of experiences that exist, that are available to the human being, to superhuman being, to superhuman levels of consciousness. And maybe the void or emptiness is one aspect of that. And then the Godhead or the universal self or a field of vibrations are like other subtle aspects. but you still find, so you have these subtle differences, but you still find the convergence and the most common things, which is the non-dual element and the fact that there's a consciousness or an intelligence element to life. So you always get that convergence. And even if there are seeming differences, I would say that they're different aspects. It's like a field of experiences, a field of things that converge, and they're not contradictory fundamentally. They can be seen as different layers of experience.
Right. All right. Shall we take a short break and then get into the Hermetic spirituality?
Okay.
And so next up, we will dive into a case study, right? To see what this
special treat for the
what
listener.
this really looks like.
Special treat just for you. A deep dive into Hermeticism by an expert in Hermeticism. Special treat.
I mean, this is a nice example. I think this is a really nice example of like an ancient spiritual tradition that actually points towards this fundamental truth, which, you know, kind of maybe people know it from Hinduism or something like non-dualism, like Advaita Vedanta or something like that, where it's really explicit. But here is actually a totally different historical, spiritual tradition. But which actually points towards the same fundamental underlying truth. And Hermeticism, which is what we're going to be looking at, has had like a major impact on the history of Western, the history of ideas in the West, basically, right? As we know, because we've studied basically the history of Hermetic philosophy and related currents, and basically it goes up to the modern New Age, you know, like the modern New Age, but also like, you know, like these occult traditions or secret societies, or like occultism from the 19th century, you know, back to the Renaissance, you know, or like alchemy is connected to this, and and other sort of Islamic esoteric traditions. So its influence has been profound, and yet a lot of people never heard about it, you know, which is so interesting.
In today's age, yeah, it used to be a thing. In part of the historical human thought that was carried down the ages, it existed in Islamism, Renaissance, all these strains of thought. But now we've forgotten, we're disconnected from our past. Only now,
right? Yeah, just to illustrate that, like in the Renaissance, when they were talking about, you know, the major prophets of old, the list would always be like Zoroaster, Hermes, Moses, Plato, and Jesus. And we kind of forgot about Hermes.
Why don't you tell us who Hermes is?
So who is Hermes? That's a big question. Hermes Trismegistus, you know,
what a man.
The thrice great Hermes.
The good.
So it's Hermes is an interesting figure because he combines sort of legend and history and mythology in a way. He's a bit ambiguous. It's like, what is his status? Is he like a god, or was he a man, a sage? Like he was sort of all of those things packed in one, right? Hermes is also equated with the Roman god Mercury. You know, Hermes is the Greek name, and then the Mercury is the Roman name, and Thoth is the Egyptian name, right? So all of these names point towards the same figure. And this is said to be kind of one of the sages, one of the prophets who brought humanity, some special wisdom. He bestowed his special gifts upon humanity in the lore around him, you know, like gifts like language itself, you know, language and understanding. Hermes or Mercury is also said to be the messenger of the gods, basically, you know, the mediator between us and the gods. There's a whole spiritual tradition that flourished around this figure in the ancient world. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the first few centuries of the Common Era, you know, which is interesting because back in the Renaissance, they thought it was actually a tradition that was much older. The tradition that would go back, you know, since before the time of Moses, and actually originated in real ancient Egypt, you know. And so currently, the texts that we have anyway, the primary sources that we have point towards, you know, this tradition flourishing around the first centuries of the Common Era.
So this is an interesting point.
In Egypt.
In Egypt, yeah, in Hellenistic Egypt, when Egypt was Greek speaking.
Right.
So this is an interesting point because a lot of people, like spiritual, esoteric people that are just laymen, just listening to these videos on YouTube and reading the Kybalion and stuff, you have these texts that frame it as if this ancient Hermetic stuff is like ancient Egyptian, like at the time when they built the pyramids. That this is where this philosophy comes from. But academically, we know that the only actual real evidence of sources that we have is around the 1st century. But I think it's correct to say that the followers or the texts themselves in that time, they speak about Hermes and Hermeticism as having gone back further than when they were writing it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Although it's a little bit unclear, there's not a explicit history of how far back that goes. But this is also the case with these half mythological, half historiographical stories that you never really quite know.
Because there is also that great story that you find in some of these New Age texts that are supposedly channeled. Like there's a book called The Raw Material, where there's this legendary feat attributed to Hermes, where it's revealed that Hermes Trismegistus actually built the pyramids with his mind. And so they go with ancient Hermes. He was there in ancient Egypt, and he manifested it with his mind. And the pyramids are a condensation of his thought creation. So really, a deeply, like extremely mythologically legendary character. And these kinds of things, it's just like a huge resonance and power to the character of Hermes.
Yeah, for sure.
And you see that in some of the mystical experiences, like where somebody meets Hermes, and it's such a profound, like the whole environment vibrates. It's like almost like the whole room becomes the quantum field or something before everyone's eyes, and then he appears. It's like this extremely radical, mystical, legendary figure.
It's also interesting that in this type of Graham Hancock narrative of the ancient apocalypse, that there was this, cataclysmic civilization that was really advanced in spiritual matters, and which Atlantis was a part of, and that when basically the big flood came, the apocalyptic flood, there were some survivors or refugees from that ancient world, who reestablished their civilization in the new world, and that it was Quetzalcoatl in the Americas, and then it was Hermes in Egypt, along with these other sages in other continents. So there's a lot of lore around
and
it.
the 7 rishis in India.
Right.
So the ancient,
and that they all bestow like language and the knowledge of technology and sort of this rationalistic outlook on life, etc.
Yeah, and so then the idea would be that the Egyptian society with their pyramids and their deep philosophical spiritual knowledge, and as well as the ancient Indian, Vedantic society with their deep philosophical spiritual knowledge, were actually seeded by the previous civilization, the Atlantean high consciousness 5th dimensional beings who who imparted their wisdom on on ancient Egypt and India. And that's actually, when we're reading the Vedas, we're actually reading the remnants of the Atlantean civilization. Right. Isn't that just a nice juicy theory?
yeah. We're gonna just bracket that and
put that
we're
on the
gonna
shelf.
look at the more academically valid theories.
Yeah. But feel free to look into that yourself if you want to.
If you want to go down that rabbit hole. By all means.
I think Rudolf Steiner is someone who speaks about that. So, channeled information.
Right.
Do with that what you will.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. So I'm gonna be. Let's take a look at like the contemporary academic perspective on Hermeticism. So then we would take a look at this book, Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination. Altered States of Knowledge in Late Antiquity by Wouter J. Hanegraaf, which is a professor of Hermetic spirituality and related currents at Amsterdam University, whom we had the privilege of also being taught by as our professor when we did the masters in Amsterdam. So it's been a really a great privilege to learn directly from Wouter, about the history of Hermeticism and the academic perspective. And this book by his is like really cutting edge academic insight into what Hermetic spirituality was really all about, because you have the radical fringe New Age theories and whatnot, but Hermetic spirituality has also been misinterpreted within the academy as being sort of akin to Greek philosophy and like really being sort of Hermetic philosophy, abstract philosophy, like treatises that speak of a certain view of the world. But what the case that Professor Hanegraaff makes is that no, really, Hermetic spirituality is all about a spiritual path of liberation, which is actually distinct and has its own flavor, and is different from what the Greeks were doing, and is different from what the Gnostics were doing, though related to all of those because it's part of that environment. So that's an interesting question. Like, what did those Hermetic thinkers, what were they really up to? These Hermetic spiritual practitioners. So, so the scene is like Egypt, Hellenistic Egypt, in like the first couple of centuries of the Common Era, right? So imagine like the Egyptian desert, with the sepia filter and like some Egyptian music in the background, and you got some pyramids, some camels riding around.
Also around the time of Christ as well, not too far from where Jesus was. 100 years or so after Christ. So similar time in history, similar place as well, not too far.
Exactly. So there were little groups of people who were meeting in little temple sanctuaries or solitary places. They were lighting incense, but not just regular incense. They were lighting Kufi incense, which actually had a psychedelic effect. The fumes of that incense had a psychedelic effect on their minds, which will already induce an altered state of knowledge, basically. And they would meet there in small groups of people who were initiated into their sect, who knew and followed the way of Hermes, the path of Hermes. Where Hermes was seen as their primary source of the revelation of their knowledge, right? Who was like their spiritual guide, so to speak. So what was their goal? Well, their goal was gnosis. What is gnosis? We've talked about this before on the podcast. Gnosis is the Greek word for special type of knowledge. Now, this is not knowledge of an intellectual kind. This is knowledge of a direct, kind of participatory, transformational nature. This is a knowledge that you get from a type of insight where your whole being is transformed. So it's knowledge beyond what we ordinarily think of as knowledge. It's direct acquaintance with a reality that is otherwise veiled.
Could also be
that's how you can think of it.
Could also be described as the equivalent to a Buddhist awakening, or when you see a Buddhist monk meditating, they're trying to gain gnosis. You can think of it like that, spiritual awakening. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what they were engaged with, basically. And then they would meet in small groups and engage in ritual practices, which involve like chanting, chanting in unison with their brethren, where they would initiate, a novice into their cult. They would be having maybe a direct revelation of the light, the pure light. It's also this idea that, well, if you're born, at the moment you're born, there's basically these celestial influences from the celestial spheres, the planetary influences. Basically, the planets are inhabited by daimonic forces. And in the moment you were born, it's those daimonic forces that enter into you. And Professor Hanegraaff explains, you're kind of like possessed by these daimonic forces by default if you're born. And what these daimonic forces do is basically they create your passions. They create your attachments to the world. They create your drives and your lust and your appetites. And all of those things kind of keep you trapped in this physical configuration, which is also inherently limiting, right? And then the idea is that through this initiatory process, there's an ascension that can happen. And so you ascend, your spirit, as it were, ascends outside of those planetary spheres. And with that, it emancipates itself from these daimonic influences and overcomes these passionate attachments until it reaches, the sphere of the fixed stars. And it transcends that even to the sphere of the ninth, which is like, because there's the 7 planetary spheres, and there's the 8th sphere, the Octoad, which is the fixed stars, and then beyond that is the Ennead, which is pure light, beyond even the fixed stars. And you need to think about this not necessarily in a spatial sense, because it's here not about a spatial cosmos that the spirit is literally traveling out of, but it's more an ascension of a state of consciousness. right? It's like the state of consciousness, the frequency of the consciousness is being raised to a higher and higher level, to the point where the frequency is so high that those lower influences no longer impact it.
Mm.
And then it reaches this state of kind of like pure light. And then here is where it becomes clear that, that this moment of kind of like a peak experience in this initiation, the novice who is being initiated, he sees the light, but in this moment that he sees the light, he realizes that him and the light, he is the light, him and the light become one. And then there's this last realization where they become one with the cosmic mind, basically, which is the nous. And in that unity with the cosmic mind, the duality between self and other is completely transcended. And so the initiate finds itself in this, state of absolute gnosis, which is what we've been talking about, right? Which is that type of enlightenment experience where the nature of reality is discovered also as the identity, and those two become one, and the characteristics which in the Hermetic tradition are attributed to that are like, light and life, that's in the fundamental nature of that. And so Professor Hannegraaf makes it explicit that it's a non-dual perspective, basically. It's a non-dual insight that the Hermetic spirituality leads up to, and so that's the basic argument that he lays out. And
Brilliantly
so with
described.
that,
Thank
it's
you.
the right.
Great description.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. I didn't know all of that. I didn't have such a clear image of it until now.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Really fascinating.
One thing I would just add for the listener, kind of the what's it, the demonic forces that are like that have like imbued in us these like passions and attachments. You could see that as like, well, that's like a spiritual kind of religious thinking or something. But really, it's just you don't have to think of it as literal demonic forces. It's the case with all these spiritual traditions where there's different ways of speaking about things. And in the Vedic or the Buddhist sense, you have samskaras, or sankharas that are like these, you know, these habit patterns, these attachments. Or in a Christian, there's always this element. There's another universal element of spiritual traditions is that you have to overcome your ego and your lower nature and your addictions and your passions and your desires and your attachments if you want to experience the higher levels of reality. But that's just another commonality found among all human thought, all spiritual thought, expressed in a poetic way. Maybe there are daimons, but it's the core kind of signature of that thought is completely universal.
Right.
And that's another interesting.
And also, also an interesting thing is that in this Hermetic tradition, it's also the idea that incarnation is not some kind of fall or something like that. No, it's a positive thing, which is almost akin to the Buddhist view. Is that like the challenge of incarnation is actually also an opportunity, which is the opportunity to find liberation, spiritual liberation in a fully embodied state. And so that means that you attain to that state of liberation, of absolute insight into the divine nature of reality, but you can bring it down into your embodiment. And then actually the purpose of that is not to escape life, which is sometimes part of the Gnostic view. It's like, the world of matter is somehow corrupt and we need to escape that. It's all about actually drawing the divine light and beauty, into this world. And from that embodiment, that comes out of that direct realization to create with beauty. That's a core part of the Hermetic teaching, which is actually why I really love it. Like it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful.
That's the one thing that struck me also as we were talking a lot about this, having this experience, this gnosis and this awakening and this shift in consciousness to experience the divine or the transcendental unity consciousness. But it struck me that also in my own kind of spiritual practice and my own kind of spiritual study of spiritual literature, what's more resonant with me at the moment is actually embodying that state, the embodiment aspect. And what you just said is a beautiful thing because I think that's a huge thing for a lot of people that's significant in their spiritual lives, which is the embodiment, embodying the spiritual reality in everyday life and letting it that light and that that experience of the transcendent and the unity, to like let that come down into the world, into the material, and to live from that state, to live in the heart space. So I was thinking maybe we could do an episode about that embodiment kind of thing later on.
Yeah, for sure.
So also to tie in the Hermeticism, yeah, thanks for that description. I think that's a beautiful, really awesome image of Hermeticism that I didn't know that kind of clarity in a nutshell version of it. Yeah, and I also love the idea of the reverence, right? It was Eusebia, which is this quality, this ethic of Hermeticism, which is a reverence for reality and a love for reality, this posture of reverence. And that's a beautiful thing, like this kind of love and the devotional, I don't know, it's just amazement and reverence for the divine.
Yeah, that's also one of the things that they say is like you could potentially do without this, luminous experience of non-duality, but what you cannot do without is reverence. Like you need to live a life of reverence. It's like that is essential. That's the one thing that's really essential. And then it's possible for you to have this experience, which just to drive home the fact that it's really about a non-dual experience. To read this one excerpt where Professor Hanegraaff says that the Ogdoad and the Ennead, which are the names, which is the name of one of these treatises that talks about that. It culminates, so that's the initiation ritual, which then leads to that, non-dual insight. It says it culminates in the silent noetic communion with the source, a perception that is no perception, an experience that is no experience, and a vision that is no vision either, because there is no subject to perceive or experience or see, and no object to be perceived or experienced or seen. It's in that moment that the duality is transcended. So the experience itself is almost like a non-experience, right? Which is so interesting and in a way also always puzzling, but very profound to my ears.
Definitely. So I think to tie it into the episode as well, to the question that we asked in the beginning, all the new currents happening in today's philosophy and science, are they reflected in the ancient wisdom? And what do we find in the ancient Hermetic philosophy? Well, we definitely find the non-dual aspect and the aspect of the consciousness, right? Everything is consciousness. Everything is light. How would you frame that, or how would you kind of receive that that interpretation of that in Hermeticism you can see it as being everything is made of consciousness, or that there's an idealist current in it? Would you say that's accurate?
No, for sure. I would for sure say that because basically their frame of what is the fundamental ground of being, or what is the fundamental substrate. It's their concept for that is the nous. So that's Nous, nous, which is also a Greek word, which Hanegraaff makes a whole argument about sort of how it's very difficult, if not impossible, to translate that term, because actually that term comes with a whole worldview, which is in a way pretty alien to us. And so often in the history of philosophy, it's been translated as mind or intellect, which is even more erroneous, intellect. And what Hanegraaff argues is that really we need to understand it as something like a cosmic, universal, all-permeating mind of the divine in a way, which is also transcendent while being immanent at the same time. It's like, that's the type of concept we're dealing with here. So, there's a lot packed into that one concept, nous. But I do think it's fundamentally convergent with idealism, because it's basically a mind, right? It's like mind at large, or the divine mind.
So yeah, I mean, and it's one of the things that is interesting about the spiritual, like, the way that people think about spirituality and the imagination of spirituality for the average person. The idea of non-duality is more commonly known, like in the spiritual community. But I think the idea of idealism, or the idea of everything is consciousness, is less emphasized a lot of the time in spiritual understanding. So you can look at Advaita, or Buddhism, or Zen, or Taoism, or Hermeticism, or Neoplatonism, and a lot of people. But let's say like the average like New Age person who's like into Eastern spirituality, they'll talk about non-duality a lot, but they'll often overlook the idealism aspect, the consciousness aspect, where it's that everything is consciousness. Like, what is, if everything is non-dual and everything is fundamentally one, then what is it? And the answer to that question a lot of the time is something like consciousness, or, spirit, or God, or the self, or, energy, frequency, awareness. But that's a key element, and that flavors it in a certain way. And that's you find that ubiquitously. Um, and so on the other hand, it's interesting because in the Bernardo Kastrup style of analytic idealism and the current panpsychism that's going on, especially with Bernardo Kastrup, I would say not that he's dualistic at all by any stretch of the imagination. His philosophy is completely non-dualistic because he says that everything is consciousness and that human beings are aspects or dissociations of universal consciousness. But he doesn't emphasize the non-dual element as much. He doesn't emphasize the non-dual aspect. And I feel like the non-dual aspect is kind of missing in today's academic philosophical discussions. Whereas in the spiritual traditions, the consciousness being fundamental element is a little bit missing, which is interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, for sure. For me, there's no doubt in my mind that this is where the answers are to be found. When it comes to constructing a new worldview, which really we have no choice but to do that. Materialism is debunked. Quantum physicists kind of present an image of reality which is still a mystery. But I think if we combine that with the insights from ancient wisdom traditions and the cutting edge of philosophy that you find in with metaphysics and ontology, it is non-dualism. It's a form of non-dualism, and I think we can debate about the concepts, like which concepts are best to use in order to understand this and frame that, and there can be debate about that. But they all sort of circle that same fundamental notion that reality is one, separation is an illusion, and the world that we experience in our everyday embodied sense is very real in a relative sense. But on an absolute level, actually, everything is one whole, and that's defined more by a certain beingness, an aliveness or an awareness or consciousness, whatever word you want to attribute to that. It's alive, it's alive and it's light, it's somehow full of that. It's maybe, there's also traditions that talk about luminous sound, like whatever poetics you want to attach to it. It's like that's where we have to look in that corner, right?
Yeah, and I think the consciousness element, if you think about just the core idea of religion, like one of the core ideas just of the notion of God, and what that means, and the idea of intelligence, the idea of there being a creator there, because I think there's a certain idea of God which is this kind of simplistic, exoteric idea of God, external, separate being God, which is not so accurate. But then you have this idea of God, which is just God as a universal being, consciousness that's manifesting the universe as itself, as an expression of itself. And just if you just think about that idea of God and intelligence, and like you say, it's mainly the fact that throughout human history and human thought, there's always been this idea that we're not just living in a material universe that has no design, no intelligence to it, and no consciousness to it. It's really almost absurd to flip it the other way and say that human beings are like the most conscious things in the universe that just emerged out of nothing. But it makes more sense that there's this like infinite nothingness consciousness, which is manifesting itself into the physical as the physical. And just that idea of intelligence, and sentience and like mindedness has always been there in religion. It's a key thing in religion. It's God, but to make it from that into a non-dual thing is what makes it different. What makes it that consciousness is the fundamental substrate, and God's consciousness, the universal mind, Brahman, is the fundamental experience. So that's where it's interesting because it gets deeper. Then it gets really deep. Then and it becomes mystical and radical. But that's only also the problem is that that's when it only really truly makes sense. When you go there to the pure non-dual state and the non-dual thought, that's when it fully clicks and it makes sense on a deep level. And before that, it never really fully makes sense. It's never fully coherent. So that's kind of a tricky thing because it becomes so mystical and strange to talk about to us, to our minds and our culture. But the actual spiritual perennial wisdom becomes true when you think about it in that non-dual mystical consciousness state. So yeah,
I think it's also interesting that in the Hermetic tradition they talk about the heart as also actually being like a mind, or the heart like literally being a mind. Um, that the organ of the heart is not just there to pump blood or something like that. It's like it's much more an organ of a different kind of perception. And I think it's in our the organ, or yeah, it's in our mind, in our brain, in our head, so to speak, that this dualism is rendered as an essential part of how we experience reality. But I
Mm,
think if we can get out of our heads and connect with our hearts, I think what we find there in a very intuitive level, just forget about all of the ideas and all about all that discourse, right? You connect with your heart,
mm,
and on an intuitive level, you find a resonance. Like you find that you actually there's a field of resonance within you and outside of you that connects you to everything around you. Where fundamentally there's no separation. Like you just participate in all of that, and it's also something that doesn't really belong to you. It's something that sort of you're just graced with being able to experience that, and there's less of a distinct sort of identity. There's more of a sort of a universal connecting principle, and an embodied type of love that you can feel there.
mm,
And I just find that very interesting. That's an idea that I've been
mm,
playing with in my life
mm.
recently, that for me as feels like it has a transformative potential.
Yeah, for sure. Beautiful. Yeah, the heart. Yeah, they see this as a kind of the embodiment thing where it's like living from the heart, living from a different spiritual center. And, the idea of the chakras is another thing that's very, very commonly found throughout history. And so the chakras, the energy systems of the body representing different aspects of our consciousness, different states, different levels of consciousness, different points of our consciousness, of our soul, of our being, our spirit. And being in the heart is another thing that you always find in the spiritual traditions. In the Hermetic tradition, in the Christian tradition with the Sacred Heart, and in the Buddhist tradition with the heart mind, and this idea that the true place that your consciousness should ultimately be is in the heart, because then you're living in this love vibration, this unity, this kind of connected space, like you said. Yeah, and I think it's interesting how when you have a heartbreak, everyone knows when you have a heartbreak, like you actually feel it in your heart physically. Why? If it's just a physical heart, why would you have feelings in your heart? Or why would you get anxious not in your
Right.
stomach? Like it's so
Yeah.
clear.
And we actually know that the electromagnetic field created by the heart organ can be measured up to 30 meters away,
Hmm,
you know?
really?
And that field is much bigger than the electromagnetic field produced by the brain, right? So it's in a way it's a much more on that level, it's much more of a defining characteristic of our being, right?
Hmm, hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered all of our topics very well. And yeah, to sum up what we've discussed, I mean, we've explained the value of having a worldview, how that defines everything, how materialism is debunked, how we have these emerging ontologies, idealism. We explored idealism and how it reflects the perennial truths. So the modern philosophy, modern quantum physics is just reflecting the universal truths. So enjoy this insight that we've produced for you today, because there's a lot of things to think about with that, and as well as the aspect of non-duality and consciousness being fundamental key thoughts that you always find in the ancient traditions. Um, so yeah, thank you for watching. And do you have anything to say? Closing remarks?
No, awesome. No, thank you so much, Andrew. And yeah, thank you for watching. If you want to help the channel, then like, comment, and subscribe. That really helps us grow. So that would be fantastic. And yeah,
Hmm.
see you at the next one.
Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe.